Hey, what is going on, guys? So we're here with Dr. Matthew Nagra to discuss the recent study that everybody's been raving about in the nutrition space online, covering 22 pairs of twins, and the comparison was between a healthy vegan diet and a healthy omnivorous diet. We'll cover the findings and I think mostly the cope online from omnivores, non-vegans, and carnivores. So we're going to start with the findings, and then after that, we'll get to the cope. Nagra, do you have anything to say before we go forward with this?
No, I think we can jump in, other than maybe outlining a bit of the methodology before we get into the findings.
Yeah, totally. So we'll get right into that now. You could just go ahead and go for it. I'm going to put some stuff on the screen while you say things, just so the images correspond with your words.
Okay. So there were 22 pairs of twins, as you mentioned. They excluded people who were very sick. So people who had a BMI of 40 or higher, which is class 3 obesity. They excluded people with LDL cholesterols of 190 or higher, blood pressures of 160 over 90 or higher. So they tried to exclude as many of people with significant risk factors from the get-go. Then they randomized all the pairs of twins to either an omnivorous or vegan diet. Now, for the first 4 weeks, because this was an 8-week trial, for the first 4 weeks, they were provided with 3 meals a day, but they were allowed to eat additional snacks or foods to meet their calorie needs, their satiety needs. Maybe they weren't feeling quite satisfied. Everybody obviously eats a little bit differently as far as how much. And they were educated on how to make healthy choices. So they did attend sessions, like educational sessions. And the main sort of guidelines were, 1, choose minimally processed foods. 2, build a balanced plate with vegetables, starch, protein, and healthy fats. Choose a variety of foods within each food group, and individualize these guidelines to meet, personal preferences and needs, if there's certain types of cuisine, perhaps, or whatever that each individual likes. Now, one thing I think we need to point out now, because it'll come up again when we get to more of the hope responses, as you said, is that this wasn't looking at an omnivorous diet where you have like a small piece of meat once a week or something. One of the main things that they wanted to do was have the omnivorous participants have meat and dairy daily. Not necessarily a ton, and not necessarily like really unhealthy type, but they want to look at what is the difference between a strictly plant-based, or as close to that as possible diet, versus an omnivorous diet where you are including the meat and dairy regularly, which I think is what most of the critics of the study would probably promote anyway. They tend to promote, based on my experience with some of the individuals that I've seen criticizing it. Now, for the last 4 weeks of the 8 weeks, they were more on their own. They were to prepare their own meals, and they weren't given those 3 free meals a day every day. So that is where we get more of a sort of real world picture of what it might look like if you just educated people a bit on how to eat these diets, and then seeing what they actually do. And they also have their dietary information collected during the 3 phases. So at baseline, before the diet change, during those first 4 weeks where they were provided with meals, and then during the subsequent 4 weeks where they were on their own. And this was done with unannounced 24-hour recalls. So they would get like a call randomly. They would go through a structured interview, and they would do it 3 times per phase. And then you would average it to get their actual dietary intake. They were also encouraged to log their food on Chronometer as well, just to provide some guidance that the dietitians could look at and maybe tweak a little bit. So that's the basic kind of outline of the methodology. Now, on to the main findings. The primary outcome was the LDL cholesterol values, and the vegan diet resulted in 13.9 milligram per deciliter lower LDL, which if you were to carry that out over a lifetime, so let's, based on Mendelian randomization studies where you look at genetic levels of LDL maintained throughout an entire life, that could translate into about 20% or even higher reduction in the risk of cardiovascular disease. So pretty significant. Obviously, these people are starting a bit later in life, though, at the time of the study or based on their ages, but if maintained long-term, it could be a meaningful reduction in risk just on that alone. Now, they also had a modest, to be generous, weight loss of 1.9 kilograms. So that's about 4 pounds over 2 months. And then there was a slight reduction in fasting insulin levels. And then the results for TMAO, trimethylamine N-oxide, was not statistically significant, but when they removed some outliers, there was a significant reduction for the vegan diet, which is kind of expected too. But those were the main biomarkers, or the main findings for the biomarkers. As far as the diet, the vegan diet did result in higher fiber intake, lower saturated fat and cholesterol intake, very small differences in polyunsaturated fat intake, like a few grams. The vegans ate more iron, but also less B12 and less protein.
Hey, what is going on, guys? Just a quick disclaimer. So I actually made a mistake when I was recording this, where basically most of my voice was not even recorded, which is really awesome. So in order to fix this, we either had to re-record the entire thing or do what I instead did, which was record voiceovers of my take on particular topics concerning the study and then playing Nagra's take. So that's how this is going to go. Basically, you'll just see a topic title and then I'll give my take on it, and then we'll move straight into Matthew Nagra's take on the topic in question. I apologize for the mistake, just didn't take my B12 and ended up accidentally muting myself for the majority of our recording. Super awesome stuff. Let's get back to the video. So the first topic is, were these findings expected given our priors on the subject of cardiometabolic health? And put very simply, for me, these results were not surprising whatsoever. With everything I know about saturated fat intake and fiber, etc., I wasn't too surprised to know that the group with the lower saturated fat intake and the higher fiber intake would achieve, say, lower LDL-C over the course of 8 weeks. Now to Nagra.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at trials specifically looking at fiber intake, saturated fat, cholesterol, and what have you. And yeah, we can kind of point in that direction of expecting lower LDL. We can also look at vegan diet or even vegetarian diet trials compared to omnivorous diets, and they tend to lead to a similar result, plus the added weight loss, largely due to lower calorie density and partly due to higher fiber, perhaps, where it's just a bit more filling on less calories. So yeah, I don't think these were unexpected. And actually, regarding the TMAO, I mean, we know that vegans tend to produce much less just because we don't foster the same sort of microbiome that you would get from eating more like red meat and eggs and whatnot. So that, that finding wasn't super surprising either, although I don't think it's really that clinically relevant, or at least there isn't good evidence to suggest that it is at this point.
All right, so this next one is conflict of interest, though, funded by the Game Changers, though, and funded by Beyond Meat, though. So the first one, funded by the Game Changers, though, comes from our boy Sean Baker, who said this in a recent video. Here it is.
The study, who was it funded by? Well, in part it was funded by the Game Changers, Foundation.
Now, I have no idea how this image that Sean showed in Sean's head was grounds for claiming that this study was funded by the Game Changers. If you read it, it says this study was funded by the Vought Foundation, the Stanford Clinical and Translational Science Award. So the study was funded by the Vought Foundation. Then there's a chart that says grants made by the Vought Foundation, and one of them goes to the Game Changers Institute. So the Vought Foundation funded both the study and the Game Changers, and then Sean takes this as evidence that the Game Changers funded the study. Not sure how he got there, but just really good comprehension skills from our boy Sean Baker. I ended up showing this to James Wilkes, and he was just laughing about it. And in regards to the Beyond Meat, though, claim that I've seen some other people make, not necessarily Sean Baker, the study itself was not funded by Beyond Meat. It was just that Christopher Gardner, one of the main authors, has been funded by them in the past for other research. So that's not even true either.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. And the whole conflict of interest thing, it's just a lazy response. If there was some sort of funding issue, or if funders were somehow influencing the study, then you should see that reflected in most cases in the methodology. Like, you should see, they did something with the methodology. They clearly biased the diet towards one versus the other, or diet quality towards one versus the other, or something like that would lead to the results that we got. But like we already said, these are completely expected based on our prior knowledge on the topic. And the only difference here is we also have now controlled for genetics, and we still get a similar result.
The omnivore group had more refined grains and sugars, though, which, by the way, this is another thing that our boy Sean Baker has claimed. I don't have much to say here because Nagra covers this very well, so let's go straight to him on this.
Yeah, so I mean, technically correct, but if you look at the amounts, the difference in refined grain intake was like less than half an ounce. And so to put that in perspective, half an ounce of white rice is 18 calories, or it's like 17 and a half calories. So and it was less than that. Like, it wasn't even half an ounce difference for them. So it's probably less than that. Now, for added sugars, there was about 6 grams. That's like 24 calories. The vegan twins, or however you want to classify them, they ate, I believe it was 174 less calories during those final 4 weeks. And so this accounts for like 40 roughly calorie difference. It doesn't even account for not even half of the caloric difference between the two. So it's just nonsense.
The calories were not matched though. So as Nagra will say soon, that is the point. It's an ad libitum study. They weren't meant to. The delivered calories were the same for both groups. It's just that one group consumed more of them than the other. Christopher Gardner actually addressed this on Twitter because so many people were bringing this up. But anyway, here's Nagra on the topic.
Well, that's the point, right? So this was meant to be ad libitum. Now, they weren't told to try to lose weight or to restrict themselves in any way, but they weren't prescribed a specific calorie amount that they needed to eat. And so this tells us that if you take a relatively high quality omnivorous diet and a relatively high quality vegan diet, and I think you can improve on either one to a degree, but we'll say fairly similar in that respect. The vegan diet tends to be more filling on less calories, so people end up eating less. Like, that's ultimately what it tells us, and that is expected. Again, plants higher in fiber tend to be lower in calorie density, and I mean, you can cherry pick some examples, sure, but generally more filling on less calories, and therefore they ended up eating less and being satisfied on that, or satiated.
Weight loss caused the LDL reduction though. So this part is a little bit confusing to me, and I've seen a lot of people saying it. The reason it's confusing is because if you actually look at the time at which they measured different markers, so at the baseline, and then at 4 weeks, and then at 8 weeks. At baseline, there were 70.9 kilograms on average, the vegans, with 110.7 LDL. And then at 4 weeks in, there were 71.1 kilograms, so they gained weight, but their LDL dropped. So they gained weight, but their LDL dropped. This goes contrary to what the whole claim is in the first place, which is that the reduction in LDL is from the reduction in weight. And then at 8 weeks in, there were 69.5 kilograms, so they lost weight, but then their LDL was 95.5. So they lost weight and their LDL went up. So if you actually observe this study in particular, you don't actually even see that weight went down as LDL went down. It was actually the opposite, which is super interesting.
Yeah, so there's a few things there, but for one, we're talking about 1.9 kilograms. Okay, it's not very much weight loss over quite a long time, over 2 months. And now there is a meta-analysis looking at weight loss trials and how much it impacts lipids. And for LDL cholesterol, each kilogram of weight lost seems to reduce LDL cholesterol by 1.28 milligrams per deciliter. Remember, they reduced their LDL by 13.9 milligrams per deciliter. So even if we grant that, okay, the weight loss might have reduced the LDL cholesterol by a degree, it's a tiny fraction of the difference that we saw. It's much better explained by the lack of cholesterol, the lower saturated fat intake, the higher fiber intake, and so on. Like, it's a really common claim that weight loss leads to these reductions in LDL, but honestly, it has a very small impact, unless you lose like a huge amount of weight. You have bariatric surgery or something and just drop your weight by, dozens of kilograms. Well, in that case, then sure, you can have more of a significant impact. But yeah, for the most part, weight loss isn't the way to lower your LDL. I mean, of course, it improves other risk factors or other markers, but for LDL, it's not a ton.
It wasn't the vegan diet that caused the benefits. It was the lower saturated fat, higher fiber, etc. that caused the benefits, though. I don't have much to say here because me and Matthew pretty much agree fully. So here is Matthew responding.
I mean, yes and no. Like, I've seen this put out there a lot. Lane Norton made a video kind of highlighting this point.
A new study was published out of Chris Gardner's lab looking at vegan diets versus omnivorous diets. The participants were 22 sets of twins. They had these sets of twins randomized to either vegan diets or omnivorous diets. Interestingly, the omnivorous group didn't really have any change in their health biomarkers. The vegan group did see some improvement in their biomarkers. Reduction in LDL cholesterol, a reduction in fasting insulin, and they saw a reduction in body weight. The plant-based folks have their football to spike and say vegan is better. I read through this study and I am not surprised at all at the results they found. The vegan group, they were on average consuming about 200 less calories per day. They saw a slight reduction in body weight, but the reduction in body weight is not enough to explain the reduction that they saw in LDL cholesterol or the reduction in insulin. When we look at the diets themselves, it is very clear as to why they saw these differences. In the first 4 weeks, the vegan group was consuming 25% less saturated fat per day and also was consuming about 15 to 20% more polyunsaturated fats. They were consuming about a third more fiber per day. These studies get overinterpreted. It isn't that the vegan diet is somehow magical. These folks were in an energy deficit. They were consuming less saturated fat, more polyunsaturated fat, and they were consuming more fiber.
But I think I would classify it as a bit of a cope. And that's because if you're looking at two diets, an omnivorous diet, that is including meat and dairy daily, right? We mentioned that at the beginning. And you compare that to a vegan diet and keep the diet quality relatively similar, almost every single time that vegan diet is going to be lower in saturated fat, higher in fiber, possibly higher in polyunsaturated fats, definitely lower in cholesterol. And so it's not, I'm not going to quite say it's inherent, because you could cherry pick specific examples where you might be able to tweak some of those variables. Like if you replace like a really lean meat with like a super high coconut oil type of plant-based meat or something, you might raise your saturated fat intake, sure. And you might be able to come up with some examples. If you replace like egg whites with something that's maybe a bit fattier for a plant-based product, sure, you might be able to skew those numbers a little bit. But generally speaking, it is like almost inherent to the vegan diet that you're going to see these benefits. And the other thing is, I take it as a bit of a straw man, because I mean, I'm sure there's like the odd vegan who's saying this kind of thing, but as far as those who are putting out nutrition content, myself, I've seen others posting about it, none of us just ignored the fact that there were these differences in macronutrient intake. We all made very clear that, adopting a vegan diet led to lower intakes of XYZ and thus lower LDL cholesterol levels, which would be predicted to lower cardiovascular risk down the road. So I just don't like the way it was framed a lot of the time. Someone who actually, I think, did a really good job discussing these points, but without just discounting the fact that it was, the vegan diet or adopting a vegan diet that led to these results, was actually Gil Carvalho from Nutrition Made Simple on YouTube. I think he did a really good job, much more of a balanced kind of approach to discussing those results. Yeah, well, for starters, LDL cholesterol is a very well-established causal risk factor for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So seeing a reduction in that, all else held equal, or in this case, even other risk factors also improving, would very likely lead to better long-term, at least cardiovascular outcomes. That being said, if this is all we had, forget about everything else. If this was in a vacuum and all we had was this, I would say, we need more data to know how this would pan out long-term. Maybe there's some unknowns that we aren't familiar with. But if we actually look at the research on vegan diets long-term, we see like lower risks of ischemic heart disease, for example, over, prospective cohorts looking at, a decade plus. So I would say that, sure, in isolation, maybe we need to look at this study in the context of, okay, it's only 8 weeks. But when we take this, we see the improvements in these risk factors, and then we pair that with the long-term prospective cohort data we have, I think we can draw more firm conclusions around like, okay, yeah, this very, very likely would lead to better outcomes long-term, as we're seeing in those studies.
The vegans weren't satisfied with the diet, though, we'll say to the same degree as the omnivores. And this is true, but another finding that just really isn't a surprise. Trying to be vegan in the first 1 to 2 months is definitely difficult, and you have to take some time to learn new things. And if you look at the metrics specifically, I think it was the eating out and food prep, which all us vegans know that the food prep aspect gets easier with time, as does the eating out aspect as you get more accustomed to vegan restaurants near you and knowing where to go, etc. These people are also in an omnivorous or non-vegan world, right? So of course it's going to be easier to eat out and all these things, being an omnivore versus being a vegan. And these people were omnivorous prior to this study, so they obviously are more comfortable prepping foods that are omnivorous as opposed to vegan. None of this is a big surprise, but Nagra will talk a little more about even the nominal status of the difference on this front.
Yeah. This one, the first person I saw it from was actually Andrew Huberman on the comments for Lane's video on Instagram there. And so he was like, yeah, this is what really stuck out to me, was the fact that they had lower satisfaction scores. So maybe they wouldn't maintain it long term. And to be fair, a lower percentage of the people who were randomized to the vegan diet said they would follow it long term. compared to the percentage of the omnivores. Mind you, it was a minority in both. It's not like most of the omnivores that were going to keep up with these healthier eating patterns, and most of the vegans said they wouldn't. In actually both cases, it was a minority who said they would continue. But what is funny is if you look at the diet satisfaction score, so it was the 5-point scale, and the difference in overall scores between the omnivores and the vegans was just 0.6. So it wasn't this huge difference in overall diet satisfaction. And in fact, the authors of the paper actually used the term nominal to point out that it's obviously a small difference. But when you break it down further into the different categories of that score, like the subcategories of that diet satisfaction score, you see that the main differences, or the biggest differences, were for eating out and food preparation. And those are two things that, as someone who's completely new to eating a vegan diet, yeah, they're going to be way harder. But that gets easier over time. You get more familiar with how to, order out or order at a restaurant, or perhaps even pick restaurants that are more favorable. You get better at prepping food and learning how to, cook different types of dishes or whatever. And so I would expect that actually over time, those scores would get better as just people become more familiar with them. And at the same time, Huberman is I'm going to pick on him again for a second because he's one of the people I saw make that comment. He's a huge proponent of going to the gym, but guess what? Most people who start going to the gym quit. So if we had a paper come out and we took twins, half of them, randomized to be sedentary, half of them randomized to start going to the gym, and we see that going to the gym led to improvements in some biomarkers, weight loss, lean mass, whatever, would he then point out, oh, but you know what? The vast majority of them said they weren't going to keep it up. Of course not, right? That's insane. We should look at the health benefits, and we can use that to inform people like, hey, if you do this and if you maintain it, these are the results you can expect. And then, yeah, a lot of people probably won't end up doing that, but some will. And we shouldn't just discount that because a lot of people won't do it. Because we can apply that to, hey, quitting smoking. Most people fail. Does that mean we shouldn't advise people to quit smoking? So they're actually, they were consuming less B12, and obviously they weren't consuming animal-based foods, so that makes sense. They may have had some fortified foods, so there was some B12 in there. But the actual B12 status, like the serum B12 levels, weren't significantly different between groups, but it's a short-term trial, right? It was 8 weeks. They weren't specifically advised to supplement in this trial because it was so short-term and you can store B12 for a period of time. If I was designing, I probably would have thrown a B12 in anyway, but or made a point to include the fortified foods. But regardless, over 2 months, it's not going to make a big difference. But the authors do note in the actual paper that they would recommend B12 supplements if you're adopting a vegan diet long term. So I think that's reasonable.
All right, guys. Well, that's the end of the video covering the twin study, including the findings in the online COPE. I appreciate you guys watching, and everybody please go follow Matthew Nagra on Instagram. I'll have his handle in the description as well as his Twitter, although I think he's more active on Instagram, right? Would you say that's true?
Yeah. Not too active on Twitter these days.
Cool. Yeah, that's probably a good thing, to be honest. And you have anything else to say before we end this?
No, I think that was good. I think we hit all the main points.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Matthew, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
Dude.
Fuck off. I don't want anything to do with you. Don't ever speak to me again. You're a fucking piece of shit.
Even vegans don't get your weird, stupid wannabe sense of irony here. Who is your audience? Nobody gets these dumb jokes. Dude.